I know that you're an outspoken advocate of MMT, modern monetary theory, and the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung actually hosted a pretty large and important conference last year in Tunis about applying MMT in the African context, which you were also a big part of. So could you maybe just lay out why you think that MMT, I mean, it's becoming increasingly popular also in the United States and Great Britain, like it's certainly an in vogue idea, but what would it mean in African countries, in relatively poor countries? How would MMT help them to bolster economic growth or create a more balanced playing field?
Yeah, MMT is the short for modern monetary theory, and it has been, let's say, promoted by major thinkers, let's say, in the West, in the United States, in Australia, etc., and also by our colleague Fadel Kabou, Denison University, with whom we organized last year a big conference in Tunis with other tourism colleagues, Ines and Maha, and also Prof. Kai Brock in Kote University. And next year in Dakar, we'll have the second edition. And why we are really interested in promoting MMT is that MMT shows clearly how the monetary system works. And MMT teaches that when you are a sovereign currency issuer, that means you have your own national currency, your own central bank, you have a control on your central bank, and you do not, let's say, issue, let's say, bonds in other countries' currency. This type of government have, let's say, strong, let's say, financial room for maneuver. That means this kind of country could fund whatever could be funded in its own currency. That means that country is not obliged, let's say, to borrow money abroad to fund what could be funded using its own real resources. For example, most African countries, they have land, they have, let's say, agricultural knowledge, yeah, they have manpower, etc. Those kind of countries, if they use their monetary powers, let's say, in a rational way, they could be able to develop their agricultural sector without relying on foreign finance. And that is what is interesting with MMT, because MMT describes how the monetary system works, and from there, MMT teaches that what is important is the real resources. What kind of resources do you have? If you have real resources, you should not, let's say, be worried about how to finance it, because how to finance it should not be a problem if you understand how the monetary system works. And I think this is a really powerful insight for, let's say, African policymakers, and we are trying to do our best to explain to people why it's important to have a minimum of monetary sovereignty, and why having a minimum of monetary sovereignty can help us develop, let's say, some sectors like the agricultural sectors, but also try to have, let's say, full employment types of policies, because MMT is also advocating, let's say, at a practical level, the idea of a job guarantee. And these are things also which could be important, because in most of Africa, the aggregate demand is low, and the countries could not rely on exports because often they are not very competitive, etc. That means they have to rely on their own domestic markets. But with a scheme like the job guarantee, you could increase aggregate demand and also increase the possibilities for domestic firms, let's say, to develop, etc. So there are many potential uses we could make of MMT.
And welcome to the next episode of Global Crisis, Global Solidarity, a bi-weekly discussion show hosted by the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and streaming live from Berlin. My name is Lauren Balhorn, and joining me as always is Fida Alzanin. We'll be hosting a discussion with today's guest. Today we're talking about debt, but not just any kind of debt. But we want to talk about something a bit broader, national debt, and specifically the debts that many countries in the global south owe to the countries of the global north and to international financial institutions. These sorts of debts, these massive debts, function as a brake on development and indeed perpetuate the gap between the global north and the global south that was supposed to have been addressed or ended with the end of colonialism decades ago, but is of course in reality not. For that reason, we're very pleased to welcome today's guest, who is both an expert on the topic and also a colleague of ours, Dr. Ndongo Sylla, a development economist with our Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung office in Dakar, Senegal, and also co-author of a forthcoming book titled Africa's Last Colonial Currency, The CFA Franc Story. He's written prolifically on questions of debt, international finance in magazines like Jacobin, and is also a leading advocate of modern monetary theory, or MMT, on the African continent. So first things first, we want to start with kind of an introductory question. The formal decolonization of the Global South, so the end of formal European dominance over the countries of Africa, large parts of Asia, is decades behind us. Every country in Africa is an independent state. They are full members of the United Nations, and many also are, or all of them are also organized in the African Union, which is an independent continental body representing the countries of Africa on the world stage. So obviously, at least on an institutional level, we've come a long way. But to what extent do you think, Ndongo, can you say that colonialism or colonial relations are really over?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Because at the wake of the independencies, we had a leader, Kwame Nkrumah. He was the president of Ghana, and he fought for the independence of Ghana. He wrote a book saying that about neocolonialism. That was his way of understanding, let's say, the challenges brought by the conquest of independence. Because he was saying that there was a formal phase of colonialism that was now over. Let's say the phase where there was a government by, let's say, metropolitan imperialist countries. But now what happened after independence was that the economic structures were still, let's say, built during the colonial period were still in full force in many African countries. That was what he called the neocolonialism, to say, for example, that the banking sector, the mining sector, and most important sectors in the productive economy were controlled by, let's say, foreign capital. And that's what he called neocolonialism. In most countries in Africa, until now, we see that this neocolonial, let's say, structuring of this of the productive sector, is still in full force. So that's why, many organizations, intellectuals are fighting to get rid of that legacy.
So if we're talking about, or if the goal is to move beyond a situation where the economic relations between Africa and the rest of the world, or at least the industrialized world, is one of a peripheral subordinate exporter region and dominant industrialized and financially powerful states, what kinds of strategies can African states deploy? I know that you're an outspoken advocate of MMT, modern monetary theory, and the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung actually hosted a pretty large and important conference last year in Tunis about applying MMT in the African context, which you were also a big part of. So could you maybe just lay out why you think that MMT, I mean, it's becoming increasingly popular also in the United States and Great Britain, like it's certainly an in vogue idea, but what would it mean in African countries, in relatively poor countries? How would MMT help them to bolster economic growth or create a more balanced playing field?
Yeah, MMT is the short for modern monetary theory, and it has been let's say, promoted by major thinkers, let's say, in the West, in the United States, in Australia, etc. And also by our colleague, Fadel Kabou, Denison University, with whom we organized last year a big conference in Tunis with other tourism colleagues, Ines and Maha, and also Prof. Kai Kodenbrock in Kote University. And next year in Dakar, we'll have the second edition. And why we are really interested in promoting MMT is that MMT shows clearly how the monetary system works. And MMT teaches that when you are a sovereign currency issuer, that means you have your own national currency, your own central bank, you have a control on your central bank, and you do not, let's say, issue, let's say, bonds in other countries' currency. This type of government have, let's say, strong, let's say, financial room for maneuver. That means this kind of country could fund whatever could be funded in its own currency. That means that country is not obliged, let's say, to borrow money abroad to fund what could be funded using its own real resources. For example, most African countries, they have land, they have, let's say, agricultural knowledge, yeah, they have manpower, etc. Those kind of those kind of countries, if they use their monetary powers, let's say in a rational way, they could be able to develop their agricultural sector without relying on foreign finance. And that is what is interesting with MMT, because MMT describes how the monetary system works, and from there, MMT teaches that what is important is the real resources. What kind of resources do you have? If you have real resources, you should not, let's say, be worried about how to finance it, because how to finance it should not be a problem if you understand how the monetary system works. And I think this is a really powerful insight for, let's say, African policymakers, and we are trying to do our best to explain to people why it's important to have a minimum of monetary sovereignty, and why having a minimum of monetary sovereignty can help us develop, let's say, some sectors like the agricultural sectors, but also try to have, let's say, full employment types of policies, because MMT is also advocating, let's say, at a practical level, the idea of a job guarantee. And these are things also which could be important, because in most of Africa, the aggregate demand is low, and the countries could not rely on exports because often they are not very competitive, etc. That means they have to rely on their own domestic markets. But with a scheme like the job guarantee, you could increase aggregate demand and also increase the possibilities for domestic firms, let's say, to develop, etc. So there are many potential uses we could make of MMT.
For those people living in the global south, how this colonial debt shows up in their everyday lives? How can we recognize its effects on their daily activities, initiatives nowadays? How does it show up in their life?
Yeah, it shows up in many ways, because every time we talk about paying the debt, servicing the debt, it's not the government, it's not the elites, it's the ordinary populations who service the debt, and they service the debt through lower public spending on health care, on education, on civil services, and also on most public services. You see, in the rural zone, you'll see there will be no support, genuine support for the rural producers. You will see that the size of the informal sector will grow disproportionately.
So you've explained to us what financial sovereignty would mean. How can states of the global south, countries of the global south, formerly colonized countries who suffered from hundreds of years of exploitation on a geopolitical scale, how does obtaining financial and monetary sovereignty, how does that move us towards a more equal world, or somehow closing the gap between the north and south? I mean, what kinds of other policies would be necessary? Because certainly, simply having control of your currency is not enough to make up for hundreds of years of colonial exploitation, no?
Yeah. We have to change the global structures for sure, because the global structures are not favorable for, let's say, most countries in the global south, who still, let's say, maintain an economic specialization they inherited from colonialism. Most countries in Africa are still raw material exporters, and they are importers of like manufacturers and high value added services. So that means that whenever you have, let's say, a commodity boom, yeah, you have economic growth. But when the prices of the raw materials decline, like with the pandemic, you see that, yeah, they will be in economic contraction, and they will have a lot of, let's say, economic difficulties. That is happening with Nigeria, with South Africa, the two biggest countries in Africa. Yeah, so that means we have to change this economic specialization. But it's not easy to change this economic specialization. Why? Because the most important economic decisions are not taken by African states, but are taken by those who have, let's say, capital. And they decide where they want to invest and, yeah, how they invest. So that has been the pattern during colonialism, and it's still now the case. When foreign direct investment comes in Africa, it's mostly in the extractive sectors. And the extractive sectors, they just pump out your economic surplus. That means the savings that could be used to develop the economy domestically will be, let's say, pumped out, to be used somewhere else. So we have to, let's say, to stop this financial bleeding by trying to mobilize domestic resources. And monetary sovereignty is really important to that end, because that means that you have to, let's say, to promote, to privilege local finance over, let's say, international finance. If you have the resources, and Africa have the real resources, so you could rely on your domestic, let's say, banking capabilities to try to finance what could be financed in your own currency.
You mentioned that the people who make the economic decisions are usually the people who have the capital. On that note, stepping away from the European-African relationship for a minute, let's talk about the People's Republic of China, which is currently the single biggest foreign lender to the African continent and to African countries. What do you make, for example, of the Chinese government's recent announcement that it will dedicate $2 billion to coronavirus relief as part of a wide-ranging debt relief program for many African countries? Do you think that the Chinese or China is a qualitatively different lender and a different kind of economic partner than the West has been?
Yeah, I would say that China has its own distinct approach towards Africa, because China was not a formal, let's say, colonial power. So that means a lot for many African countries. And China also does not lecture African countries on, let's say, human rights, democracy, and so on. And at the same time, we have seen that China has been more efficient in building some kind of infrastructures, etc. But still, China acts like any imperialist power. That means China wants to secure raw materials, want to secure, let's say, markets for its companies, want to have some influence on Africa, because China want to, let's say, to extend its influence, etc. So that means that so there are some differences, let's say, in the approach. But still, the Chinese approach maintains African countries in the economic specialization they inherited from colonialism. And that's why you see, for example, Angola, the countries which is the most indebted, let's say, towards China, is still in the, let's say, in the oil business. When the oil prices are good, there is economic growth, and when the oil prices are down, you have a lot of difficulties. And it's still interesting to see, for example, last year, Angola issued, let's say, a Eurobond to partly, let's say, service its debt to China. And now China is coming back saying that, I want to reduce the debt of African countries, because there have been some pressures from Western powers say that China is not playing the game, etc. You see, but it still remains, let's say, a game between, let's say, dominant hegemonic powers, and this has to change. We have to change the partnership with China as well as the traditional Western powers. But about the debt, we must say that China is not the most important, let's say, it's not the main obstacle, I would say, because now the main obstacle in Africa to, let's say, to solve this external debt crisis is the debt held by the private creditors. Because before, the type of debt we have was debt owed to the likes of the World Bank, the IMF, and to, let's say, individual countries like Germany, like Japan, France, etc. But now, more or less 42% in 2018 of Africa's public external debt was owed to private creditors through, let's say, Eurobonds that had been issued by African countries. And those private creditors, they don't want to cancel the debt. They do not want to, let's say, to discuss about, let's say, a standstill or even, some debt relief. So this is the huge issue about Africa's debt now.
Thanks so much for all of your time, Ndongo. We're almost out, but I want to ask you one last question before we have to wrap up this episode. The name of our show, as I'm sure you know at this point, is Global Crisis, Global Solidarity. We know what the crisis is. In many ways, you could argue that colonialism is a crisis lasting hundreds of years that has not ended to this day. But we want to ask you a little bit about global solidarity, right? I mean, obviously there are massive economic, social, cultural gaps between the industrialized North and large parts of the global South. Do you think that something like a global solidarity is possible? And maybe more specifically, can tools like MMT help to heal these rifts or close these gaps and put us on the way towards something more like a truly equal global community?
Yeah, I think it's possible, but most of all, it's necessary, because if you want to tackle the, let's say, climate change, this has to be done in a framework of global solidarity. This is the main, let's say, threat, the main challenge humanity is facing. And that means that if we look at how the monetary system works, the world has the means, financial means, has resources, the real resources, let's say, to organize, let's say, the humanity in a better way, so that everybody could live, let's say, a decent life, and within the respect of, let's say, the ecological limits. That is possible. We could not say that the humanity lacks financial means to tackle climate change. We have the financial means. Now we have to have the political will to change all of that. And if we are to achieve, let's say, that objective, we need global solidarity. That means more help to the global South. But when we say more help, that means renewed form of helps which are not, let's say, driven by imperial interests and so on, capitalist logic, but how to live better in a world, let's say, of equals.